Hi there, and welcome to another interview. I will be honest, I'm a fanboy of this particular person and have been for
Mhm.
many years. And just to set the scene, I first noticed Belinda, who is my fantastic guest today, when I was watching an interview about a guy called Gary Fettke.
Thank
Um,
you.
yes, and I bet everyone gets that wrong. Um,
Yes.
and I noticed that in the interview that Belinda was in the background a little bit, but once she came to the foreground, I thought, "Wow, this person is going to set the world alight and put up some trees." So it's really great that after all these years, I finally get to interview Belinda. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I sort of touched on it there that you were defending your husband, and maybe you could just give a little sort of potted history of what that was about. And in the process of defending your husband in the situation that you're just about to explain, you started to go down some rabbit holes. And I think one of the biggest ones that we'll talk about eventually is the blue zones. But if you could just set the scene for everybody, that would be fantastic.
Stephen, it's been a very interesting time. Gary's an orthopedic surgeon here in Tasmania. We have a catchment area of about 140,000 people in the whole of the north of Tasmania. And as an orthopedic surgeon, we didn't have anyone who was a vascular surgeon permanently in this area. So Gary was responsible for looking after people with type 2 diabetes, their complications. He was operating, debriding, and unfortunately amputating way too many toes, feet, and even lower legs as time went on. If you To put it in perspective, when Gary first started medicine or orthopedics, he might see someone maybe once or twice a year that required that sort of surgery. But by 2016, here in northern Tasmania, he was seeing someone every single week. And as you know, Stephen, you don't go into medicine to create harm. You go into medicine to make people better. I mean, that's how you bring joy back to the work that you do. And so that's 2016, but we'll take a step back. And Gary started to understand the health benefits of low carbohydrate, healthy fat principles. Or even earlier than that, it was just reducing sugar. like he just worked it out. He started to get better for his own health, and he thought about his patients. And we're looking specifically here at type 2 diabetes, so we know it actually improves outcomes for people with type 1 diabetes as well. But if you just sit in this type 2 diabetes spot where Gary was mostly there, reducing sugar helped to stabilize people's blood glucose. Reducing sugar stopped a lot of the issues, and I'm not just type 2 diabetes, but with all surgeries, there's a constrictor effect of sugar and high carb diet. So Gary would get people and smoking, get people to stop smoking and then move on to sugar as well to improve their health outcomes. But he had no idea he was stepping on toes that were going to come after him. So when Gary was reported to the medical board in 2014, so this is about 2.5 years later, we thought, oh my gosh, like the dietitian reported him for recommending that his patient with out of control blood glucose and severe complications of type 2 diabetes reduce their sugar because the diabetic menu at the hospital included 3 desserts per day. It was a high carb, low fat diet. These people weren't getting enough protein to heal this ulcerating flesh. And so Gary just said, look, reduce sugar. Well, he got so upset about everything, he actually put it in the patient's notes. It was part of his recommendations. But again, it wasn't the patient had to do it, but he just was so angry with the hospital for just feeding them so much sugar that he was trying to make a point almost more about that, but also trying to educate his patients. And so the dietitian thought he was working outside his scope of practice as a doctor who's learned biology and physiology and anatomy and physiology. So he went, well, this doesn't really make sense. We thought, surely the medical board's just going to throw this out, Stephen. It was just so ridiculous. And we're just so surprised when they decided they would investigate. So they investigated Gary for 2.5 years. As I say, he started with sugar and then he moved to low carb, healthy fats. The investigation went the entire time, and by 2016, he'd had a determination put on him that he was not allowed to open his mouth. He was not allowed to talk about nutrition for the rest of his medical career. So he could operate, he just couldn't open his mouth. And he decided he would work against that ruling. He would never bow to that. So he kept talking to his patients about the importance of diet and reducing sugar and processed carbohydrates and including animal proteins and fats. But he joined a group here called Low Carb Down Under very early on, maybe 2013. And I was watching all of these people at different conferences, like the public were just getting so much out of it. And the few health professionals that came along also. But we saw people really taking back control of their health, reducing metabolic disease, and even reversing type 2 diabetes. So I said to Gary, it doesn't matter how much you people are talking about the science, it's not getting through to the guidelines. You're still being investigated. So I guess my first point of call was to work out who had been brought in as the expert witness for the medical board. In Australia, normally it would be a peer, someone who lived fairly locally. Now, Tasmania's at the very bottom of Australia. We're a little island. So Launceston's the north. It should really have been someone from Hobart, but it could have been someone from Victoria or Melbourne. And it should have been an orthopedic surgeon, and they should have said, oh, recommending someone reduces sugar if their blood glucose is out of control. Maybe it makes sense or maybe it doesn't. It should have been there. But they brought in the biggest nutrition gun in the Southeast Asia Pacific region to determine if a orthopedic surgeon could say something so terrible against the guidelines. So I wrote to this man. I thought he was at Deakin University, Monash University. He was in Asia. And so I wrote to all of these places and I said, I actually think if you listened to Gary, I think you could have a really amazing discussion and come to understand why he's talking about this. Well, he didn't answer. So I thought, right, I'm going to keep looking. I thought he must work for the sugar industry. But as I delved deeper and deeper, I found out he was working for cereal industry. And here in Australia, the cereal industry that he was working for was called Sanitarium. Or, yes, he worked there from 2000 to 2016 at least. But I found that on the Wayback Machine, which is an archival machine that I was able to find lots of things on over the last decade of my research. And it slowly tweaked in my head that Sanitarium here is owned by a church. It's owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why do they have this belief? I also knew that they talked about vegetarian food, and Sanitarium is the health and well-being company here in Australia. They provide resources for, as I have done more and more research, resources for GPs to print out with a click of a button about type 2 diabetes, about pregnancy, about metabolic disease, cardiac disease, everything you can think of. And I looked at these resources and they just were promoting low fat, high carb foods, a lot of the cereals that they make. And in Australia, Aussie kids are Wheat Bix kids, which is what Sanitarium makes. It's a slogan. And I would tell you, if you said that, everyone would say, oh, yes, I was an Aussie kid eating Wheat Bix growing up. So they might have a very small physical footprint, and you almost don't even know that they're a church. Most people wouldn't know. But their influence on our dietary and health guidelines and starting to realize that they were promoting a vegetarian diet, they were anti-animal proteins and fats. I just started doing more and more research. So hence, you're hearing about me. I'm speaking next to an amazing beach in Spain with Gary. We've traveled the world talking about this. I will say by 2018, when I submitted so much information, we ended up going to an ombudsman and they took it to the national board, and Gary's case was thrown out in less than a week. But it had been investigated for 2.5 years. So finally in 2018, 4.5 years later, we could say Gary was cleared, and the national board said that even if they just said, there's never going to be any restriction on this, and we're not going to go down this way. But it's taken Gary until 2023 with another group of really amazing people in this space to finally get the guidelines to change for type 2 diabetes. And now low carb is not considered a dangerous woo woo diet because they've shown so many health benefits. I think Australia is actually one of the first places, but that was Gary's determination, because they said to him at the beginning, "You're not following the guidelines, and if you want this to be the guidelines, you'll have to change them." So he did, 2023 with
Yes.
others.
And it is an amazing story, and possibly no one's ever asked you this before, but did it change you as people?
Oh, I think it did change us, but also Gary and I started going out when I was 16 and he was 18. We'd gone to the same school. He'd left by then, but he came back to my year 11 formal with another girl, and we crossed eyes and fell in love. So we were going out since I was 16. And so because we'd grown up together, we'd made adult decisions together. When this group came after my husband, I say when Cyril for Brekkie came after my husband, the mama bear came out and I came out defending Gary. And I think a lot of the information that I uncovered, Gary would never have gone looking for. He had the science, but I had the anti science. I had the vested interest coming after him. And so, and in all honesty, it wasn't just the church either. It wasn't just Sanitarium. It's come from Coca Cola. It's come from, I would say, Novo Nordisk. It's come from the International Life Sciences Institute. Like there's many institutions that do not want low carb, healthy fat to be a, a recommended diet, or certainly keto or even carnivore, because it takes processed food out of the equation. It takes all the sugary drinks. It takes all the like, there's so much. The cascade effect is massive. So, but in this particular case, and as something that's completely different to where anyone else had been researching, I have found the church was very influential
Mm,
in determining that my husband should be silenced. So, yes, we have grown together. And I think I was a photographer while Gary was starting his no sugar, no fructose escapade, I guess, at the beginning. And certainly going into this space, I was supporting him, but I wasn't really part of it. And then when they came after Gary, we moved together, and he was actually the first one to talk about my research at the CrossFit Games. I think it was 2000 and maybe 16. We just didn't talk about it, Stephen, because I'd grown up in a very Christian household family, and I found it really challenging as I was going deeper and deeper into this research. Not so much about the corporate church, because there's a lot of corporate church in healthcare,
mm,
in education, and in food industries. But the people who belonged to that church, the people who had given their lives to this church, I started to get really quite worried about what I might do to them in coming up with this information. And what's been an incredible part of this journey is having a lot of people contact me who've left the church, a lot of people who've contacted me who've gotten sick in the church. And I've even had a couple of people who are Seventh day Adventists contact me to also say they've gotten sick eating the church's recommendations and food. So I feel almost like it's been a very privileged place over time, because I've tried to do it respectfully. It's not about the individuals in the church. This is the corporate capture of our dietary and health guidelines. And this is the corporate capture of really coming after people to stop them talking about the health benefits of low carb and healthy fat. So this is where I've come from. I'm not anti-vegan or anti-vegetarian. I'm certainly not anti-religion, and people have their own choice. They have the right to that choice. But when that choice is being taken away by a church, by industry, by Coca-Cola, and by pharmaceutical industries, then I feel like I have the right to go, whoa, wait a minute, this needs to be broadcast. And then people have the choice with which way they want to go. Because if you look at the guidelines, America is that graphic has changed. And
mhm.
so if you look at visuals, which I think a lot of people do, I was a nurse in my past life. And when I say past life, someone actually said, was she born again? I mean, when I was young. So um, it seems like a lifetime ago. But yes, when I was nursing, I think people are very drawn to a graphic, and that's what they see. So while some of the writing behind the new American dietary guideline might not quite equate to what we're seeing as a visual, the visual will make a big impact on people and I think be very, very helpful for our cause going forward. They're not going to sit there and read 80 pages. So for us, it's great. Um, but I think dietary guidelines in the UK, dietary guidelines here in Australia, we're still really stuck on the fear of fat, fear of cholesterol,
Mm.
and I don't know that we'll get past it. I've done a lot of research into it, but let's try.
Yeah, and
And yes, so
it's
Gary and I have gotten closer. Sorry, we've traveled the world speaking, so it's been fantastic. Very
yeah,
supportive of
I
each
think
other.
the reason I asked is because, um, my journey is similar in the nature of you can't believe the more you uncover, um,
Mm,
you're only trying to make people healthier. I mean, my
yes,
background is obesity and diabetes. I'm a specialist practitioner, and before I learnt about low carb, I was a failure. I spent 4 years advocating high carb diets and following the guidelines, way back, when I
yes,
started. And it was only when I went low carb I started to get success. And the only reason I actually had the scales removed from my eyes was
yes.
people coming in doing well. This is when I was a high carb specialist practitioner
Okay.
in those conditions, and me saying to the odd person, "Well,
What?
you're doing great. What you're doing?" And they just basically said, "We're ignoring you. I'm sorry, Stephen, but we're trying Atkins or we're trying this and we're trying,"
Yes.
and it was real people. And I think this is very basic, Belinda, but um, when you see real people getting better, and then you look at um, the guidelines and they don't marry up, it makes your blood boil a little bit. And yes, it took me 4 years
It
to
does.
wake up myself. So I will admit, it does take a long time, but these people know it. To me, it's nefarious. I'm sorry, but they do know what they're doing.
Well, yes, but I'm sorry, not all the individuals in the church understand what's because they're getting sick too. Yes,
Yeah.
the corporates, the people at the
Yes.
top, they do know. And that's why I've been loud and been calling out. But it's really sad, Stephen. And Gary was the same. Luckily, he did a lot of work that also involved, well, not luckily, he was also involved in a lot of, kids breaking their arms and getting to put those back,
Mm,
together. And so it was beyond just that one specialty area, but it was becoming bigger and bigger. But he ended up putting up a post on Facebook and just saying, I'm sorry. I'm
mm,
sorry I didn't listen sooner. I'm sorry I didn't think about this sooner. And it took his own health journey to discover it and then start to see the benefits in his patients. But you've got to think it's like I talk about Elizabeth Kubler Ross and her grieving process. And that's what doctors have to go through, healthcare professionals. If they've been prescribing harm, which really
mhm.
following guidelines is prescribing harm, it's very hard to admit and say, I'm sorry. It's very hard if you've spent your entire career realizing you haven't really helped a lot of people. And to come away from that, I think at the end of a career, it's hard to admit it. You just go, "Oh, I'm just going to keep going. What's the point in trying to change now?" And you also have to come up against regulation if you challenge the guidelines. So there are so many factors there. And congratulations to you for listening to your patients because that's a really, really big thing to say. Uh, Gary and David Unwin, they've both spoken at different times. I've heard them talk about, the black swan. Well, in the UK, you have white swans. Well, here in Australia, we have black swans and white swans. But if you see a black swan, you can't say, oh, well, I'll go back to the UK and there's only white ones there. So it's all white. That was just an aberration. No, there's actually a black swan. And
Mm.
that black swan is going to tell a very different story. And if you listen to that, say, well, actually, there might be something in this. And so, yeah,
Mm.
congratulations to you for listening because I don't think a lot of people do.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You're right. Admitting that you've made a mistake is difficult, but it is worth doing. And I'm so glad
Mm.
that it only took me 4 years because I've now had 11
Yes.
years to do it right, I suppose. So
Yes.
just going to sort of shift gears a little bit and be a little bit more
Mhm.
specific because this is something that's close to my heart and to your heart.
Yes.
I've
Mhm.
been following your Substack articles. I think
Thank
you
you.
read one of mine, and
Ah,
we
yes. I've read a lot of yours actually, but I love the Mediterranean one. Oh, let's just sit back. Yeah. Amazing.
it's the wonderful blue zones.
Ah,
So,
the blue zones.
um, I'm just gonna
Now
say, go for it, Belinda.
no,
What do
no.
you think of the
Oh,
blue
go for it.
zones?
Okay. So I was getting tired, Stephen, of I started speaking out about the blue zones on the back of a lot of beautiful work by the Weston A. Price Foundation, Sally Fallon
Mm,
Morell. I devoured her work back in probably right at the beginning of all of this because I was trying to work out where did the meat go? Like in the guidelines, I hadn't even noticed that suddenly there was no red meat anymore. It was getting less and less. And so I read a lot of her work, and she talked about different people or different people had contributed about the blue zones. So I was getting an understanding of that back then. I think I'd missed the 2005 National Geographic article, but I was vaguely aware of it. But certainly when I read Sally's work, I learned a lot more about it. And in particular, in 2019, an Australian academic, Saul Newman, he talked about the issues that he was uncovering with the birth certificates. And so he thought the whole thing was all built on fraud. He uncovered that there was a lot of people who were smoking and drinking and doing all the things that public health narratives were very anti, and it shouldn't have been contributing to longevity at all. But he kept challenging the birth certificates. So I was aware of his work as soon as it came out because it was here in Australia and I was looking into this space. And I originally spoke about the blue zones, Sally's work, the work that I was doing, and Saul Newman in 2019 at Low Carb USA. It was a big event in San Diego. And it was a bit of a surprise. And I kept talking about all my work, lots of my research, especially into Seventh-day Adventist Church, into a particular thing called lifestyle medicine, which has worried me right from the outset again. It was founded on the grounds of Loma Linda University, which is owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in America and has so many sister organizations around the world, including the UK. At the time when I started researching, they were very, very influenced by not only the Seventh-day Adventist Church beliefs, but Coca-Cola. The two of them had partnered up in this very unusual symbiotic relationship because they were both demonizing animal protein and fat. So minimizing the harms of sugar or promoting the biblical Garden of Eden, the fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds, it suited because they're both demonizing animal protein and fat. So that was also a big trigger for me was lifestyle medicine. But I was I said to Gary in about 2022, COVID had been, daughter had come home, we had grandchildren, and I just said to Gary, I'm just so over it. I've talked about all of these things. I don't know if anyone's really listening, so thank you for listening. Um, I just said to Gary, I'm having a couple of years off. Or I actually thought I was finishing. I thought I don't need to do any more. My work's out there. And then the Netflix documentary, How to Live to 100, came out in 2023. And I was like, ding, 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 ding. All of the pieces started to come together. I went back in there and I've gone, yeah, I need to look right back into the history. Again, the further back you look or the farther back you look, the farther forward you can see, thanks to Winston Churchill. And he's exactly right. I just went right back into the history of these blue zones, past the 1999 when Giovanni Pes and Michel Pula were circling that mountainous area in Sardinia, and they discovered a particular area of longevity, which, if you read Michel Pula's work, he was a demographer, and he says that age validation was truly um, he believed all of the markers were discovered in this area. Admittedly, he and Giovanni Pes were looking for a genetic aberration because these people had been isolated for a very long time. And they believed some sort of gene had been, I guess, become dominant in this area. And this is why these people were living longer. But they admit they discovered it was place. It was the people living in this place. It was the way they lived. It was what they were eating. It was how they were raising animals. No fertilizer inputs because the animals were fertilizing the ground, so the chemicals weren't there. The Western industrial food wasn't there. They were living very simple lives. They weren't highly educated, but I'm not saying they weren't intelligent. They had generational wisdom as to how to
mm,
prepare food and look after themselves. Sardinia was defined, I guess, in 1999, and they started presenting and talking about it in the 2000s. I think they first wrote up in 2004. At the same time, Dan Buettner from America, he was an adventurer and a journalist, and I think ready to set his teeth into something. I found out at the time he was going out with a vegan model. And so he was probably a bit swayed by her and her belief systems. So he heard about Okinawa being designated a longevity region. And Matsuko Suzuki came from Tokyo in 1976 to Okinawa. And I think he was doing a lot of work. He was a gerontologist and doing a lot of work there and really discovering some incredible some elders that were reaching incredible ages. And so he was doing studies in this area. So Dan Buettner popped over to Okinawa and he pitched the quest to National Geographic to solve the mystery of longevity because he had Okinawa and he had Sardinia. But apparently the editor said he had to pick somewhere in America.
mm,
And the Adventist health studies were probably the biggest promoter at the time of, he says longevity, but if you speak to the people who are doing the research, they say it was life expectancy and disease prevention. So there was no longevity. Yes, Dan Buettner interviewed some people in their 90s, I think even someone who was in the hundreds back in 2004, 2005. And they were doing exceptionally well, and we'll get to talking about why potentially. So he had admitted those people and said they're the three. And then in 2007, they discovered Ikaria and Nicoya, or might have been the other way around, both 2007, 2008. They were the 5 designated blue zones. Well, as you've seen in my Substack, the only thing I've worked out that they all have in common is they end with the letter A, Stephen. So that means Tasmania in Australia, we've got longevity covered. So
perfect.
sorry about the UK. Wrong letters. So yes, that's the only thing I've been able to discover is the one factor they all have together. Though mind you, I'm doing another Substack which you'll be interested in looking at Singapore as the Blue Zone 2.0. I won't go into all of that now, but Singapore doesn't end in A. So I've gone back and realized that the big difference between Singapore and the other 5 actually all get government pensions.
Hmm.
So there's actually 2 things, but the letter A sounded so much better for my map. It was fun. So there you go. Okinawa, going back into the history of Okinawa. So this place in Sardinia had been isolated for a very, very long time because the conquerors had come through and wanted the fertile lands at the bottom. They'd wanted the coastline. And these people really had been isolated for a couple of centuries. Not always, because the shepherds went down to the bottom and they traded and did things and came back up. So I'm not saying they were completely isolated, but very isolated in how they lived and very isolated in what they ate. And in Okinawa, you think about this birth certificate with Suzuki doing these studies. Okinawa was the place of the bloodiest battle in World War II. And I describe, I think before the war, there were 100,000 pigs on
Mhm.
on the island of Okinawa. And after the war, there was only 800 left. So once the American military occupied Okinawa, they won the war. The Japanese had, I guess, murdered a lot of Okinawan civilians. So between the war and illnesses and being murdered, there was something like a third of civilians lost their lives. Massive destruction of crops, livestock, and also their homes. 93% of the buildings were destroyed on Okinawa. You have to understand that Okinawans write their birth certificates and their death certificates. It's kept in a family register in their homes. So that would mean that 93% of the Kasiki were also destroyed in the war. Now, I'm not blaming anyone. If I lost everything, lost my family, lost my food supplies, because even by 1949, the American military did a survey and were filling out a lot of forms for the government. And they said there was not enough food, not enough crops, not enough livestock for anyone to barely, it was pretty much war rationing still, and certainly not enough food for anyone to become obese. And they described the lack of livestock for them. And so they introduced spam. So where they had a lot of pig before, then they were suddenly having the canned meat. And I think 72 million cans per year are eaten in Okinawa now. So again, I'm trying to challenge, I guess, the idea that the blue zones are this plant-based
mm,
mecca that we're all supposed to be following this checklist to say, move more, do this, do that, do this. When you take that out of place, out of context, is it going to have the same longevity? Can you franchise longevity if you remove it from its source and you tweak the messaging to fit a narrative that's going to suit Americans? Because you're selling it to a group of people who fear saturated fat in 2005, especially, and you're selling it to a group of people who live indoors, work on computers, under artificial lighting. So the idea of being out in the sun and moving and all those things are wonderful. And then throw in plant-based diet, it sounds like it's going to be the magic pill, the longevity pill. But Okinawans didn't only eat plants. Yes, in 1949, during this survey, when they were asked what they eat, morning, lunch, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it was a lot of sweet potato, because sweet potato survives a war, it survives typhoons, and it survives poverty. It's in the ground and they can pull them up. So they were eating a lot, but it didn't stop them still eating other animal proteins and fats. And one of the few Asian countries that actually drinks goat's milk. Most Asian countries that don't have dairy. And Okinawa became part of Japan, but then it became American and then it became Japanese again, but they never actually were Buddhists. They'd been part of the Ryukyu kingdom, an independent country. So they didn't have any taboos about what animals they could or couldn't eat, or that they couldn't harm an animal. So a very, very different place, even though it's so tiny and it's now part of Japan, the food was very different. And this Kasiki, if you think that the military rewrote everybody's birth certificates, can you imagine if you'd lost everything and the government's going to give you a pension
mm,
if you're getting to 60? Why wouldn't you say you were born 10 years later?
yeah.
Or 10 years earlier, sorry, 10 years
Mm,
earlier, because it would make sense. The thing was, Okinawa had no longevity advantage in 1980 compared to the rest of Japan before Suzuki went there, or around the time he went there. But suddenly, by 2010, I think there were so many people were 110 and 115 years old. It doesn't make sense to
no.
have that many. And now, 10 years, 15 years later, that longevity's completely disappeared again. And now, unfortunately, Okinawans are some of the unhealthiest people in Japan. And I would say a lot of that is due to Americanization of the food. When the American troops came, I think Coca-Cola bottling plant was just off the coast, and as soon as the Americans won the war, that Coca-Cola bottling plant was in there within a week,
Mm,
setting up. And a lot of the fast foods have come in because there's still a lot of American, and it would be the same with any Western country. A lot of the foods and fast foods were brought in, but a lot of, yeah, it just, their food culture changed a lot. Yes, there's still some areas that eat more traditional food, but they're not only plants. They eat seaweed, yes, but they eat pork. And I also talked about I think I've done a big study on pigs. And in each of these four areas, not Loma Linda, but in Sardinia, Okinawa, Ikaria, and Nicoya, they all ate pigs as a way to survive. And they would raise that pig on kitchen scraps. Some of them, especially in Sardinia, were still eating chestnuts and acorns and um, living in the forest. They would hunt them as
mhm,
well. But these pigs provided fat, and the fat they were able to cook with, fat to preserve meats, which was such an important part for them to get through the year, to keep having that animal protein and fat, which was so important to them. And they also used it for soap. So in Sardinia, unlike Greece, even though they grew olives, I read an article or research paper by a lady called Karima Moya Noki. And she said barely anybody made olive oil to cook with. They would sometimes put it on a salad, but they didn't cook with it or preserve foods with it. They kept using lard in Italy for a very long time. Greece had a lot more olives, and they were more into making the olive oils. But even in Icaria, even in Greece, they still used a lot of pig lard. It's shelf stable and it lasts, I think, is it 5 gallons from one pig, 20 litres? So they make a lot of, they're an incredible resource for people, especially people who don't have a lot of money. And so then we go off to, I'll stay in the ancestral ones first, go off to Icaria. And this is the one place where potentially Dan Butner could say they don't eat a lot of meat. If he'd gone during Lent or a period of fasting in Greek Orthodox Church, they don't eat meat. They don't eat fish. Unlike Roman Catholicism, which bans warm-blooded animals during fasting, but not nearly as long a period as the Greek Orthodox, which is 120 to 180 days a year, Stephen. Almost half of the year, a third to a half that people are fasting for religious reasons, religious observances. So Roman Catholicism is warm-blooded, but they can still eat fish. In Greek Orthodox, they're not allowed to eat red blood. But I was thinking, what religion? Because I've looked all the way back. I've gone through the Jain religion. I've gone through like a whole lot of Eastern religions to try and find this, I guess, demonization of animal protein and fats. But the Greek Orthodox Church had this idea that I guess when the canonical texts were first written, if you saw something that bled, you couldn't eat it. So fish bleed. No fish, even in their fasting. But they were allowed to eat shellfish. Oh, well, that's weird. Why can they eat shellfish? And shellfish have blue blood. Instead of hemoglobin, it's hemocyanin and it's copper-based. So they were allowed to eat shellfish, squid, mussels, and even snails, which made a lot of sense because Icaria, not like Sardinia, where they had invaders and different groups taking over the land, there was a lot of piracy. Icaria is a very small rocky island, and there's only 5,000 people who live there. 8,000 people who live there permanently, 35,000 goats. But pirates would come. So when the people went down to the ocean to catch things, the pirates would come and say, "Thank you very much, we'll take that." So they lived inland mostly. And you'll even read that they barely ate fish, even though they're an island in the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
Scary. They they reserved fish for funerals, and they ate a lot of snails, far more snails than they eat in France, because they were a permitted food during fasts. They ate a lot of snails. So snails are animal protein and animal fats. And I guess this is where Weston A. Price's work's just so amazing, because the places that he visited as a dentist in the 1930s, trying to look for reasons why people were, he said, their teeth were crowding, they were getting holes in their teeth, and their physical bodies were degenerating. The pockets of people that he found who had beautiful jaws, straight teeth, and strong physiques were dotted around but hadn't been introduced to Western industrial foods. And
Mm.
even though they ate bizarrely different foods, so in the Arctic they were eating whale blubber and that sort of thing, in the Swiss Gaelic, and then you had the Islanders, and then you had Australian Aborigines. Very, very different diets, 14 different diets. But they all had incredible amounts of vitamin A, D, and K2, which are from animal protein and fat in particular. Just these incredible packages. And sometimes it might look like a low fat food, but as I say, the K2 value in emu oil, which is found in this tiny little pocket, the back of an emu, which is a very large flightless bird here in Australia, the vitamin K2 level was something like 15 times higher than you would find in normal fat of, say, a
Mhm.
um, a cow. And so I believe that all of these ancestral communities that have been designated as a blue zone, whether their birth certificates are right or not, because as we know in Okinawa, potentially they weren't, and they also found in some other places that people were changing their ages to get pensions earlier. I think in Japan there was 230,000 centenarians were missing, and the same in Italy. And so there is a question on those, but if you take that out of the equation and you're just purely looking at their food, they weren't eating only plants, even the Icarians. And then you get to Nicoya, and the Spanish came and introduced cattle, but they already had pigs, they already had all these other animals. So again, trust me, the researchers in Nicoya, who originally determined that these people had longevity and offered them up to the Blue Zone manifesto, they've since said in 2015, I think their article said their diet never fitted the Mediterranean diet, the low fat diet, the oh, what range of diets. It didn't fit those diets because they ate too much animal protein and fat, and they didn't eat salad. Heavens, heaven above, they didn't eat salad. Ah, how did they survive? How did they actually become healthy and have longevity if they didn't eat salad? So we're talking about all these things. So again, go back to that longevity pill. How do you sell it to America? You pick Loma Linda, and Loma Linda is an Adventist enclave, so different to all of these places that didn't have a lot of education. They tended to be poorer in their communities. When I say that, financially poorer, not necessarily community poorer or food poorer. It was just packaged differently. And in Loma Linda, you it was founded by the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In fact, she bought an abandoned hotel in 1905 at a very reduced price because it had been abandoned for about 15 years, I think, after all the railroads were laid in California, in that area, because it housed the railway workers at the beginning, and when they were all laid, they didn't need it anymore, and they could too. Lots of financiers had tried to create resorts from it, and then Ellen G. White saw this place. At the time, she was having a bit of an issue with John Harvey Kellogg, who'd been a devout Seventh-day Adventist and grown up in the church. So she moved the whole of the church administration and their workings, their printing press and everything, to Loma Linda. Then it was called Mound City. By the time that the end of the first year of being there in 1905, they'd already started the first food industry, Loma Linda Foods. They'd start and making health food to take the place of flesh meat, eggs, milk, and butter. They'd started nursing training. They'd opened their sanitarium. By 1909, they'd started the College of Medical Evangelists to start training medical missionaries, and with a very, very big belief that public health was a duty of the church, medical evangelism was the right arm of the church, and their health reform message that we should be eating fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds, and that animal proteins and fats were a toxic stimulant and it defiled not only men but women and children. So this is the belief of Loma Linda. This is the setting. And now I showed pictures in a talk that I gave in America in last year. And the Loma Linda University Hospital is 10 feet tall. It's this massive glass place. It employs 18,000 people. This is an academic, affluent, retiree enclave that they chose to be Loma Linda. And I often say, or especially when I was in America, I said, if you're really looking for a blue zone, you don't need to travel the world to all these resorts. You could just go to Loma Linda and see how these retirees live. And some of them live very well. Did they eat fruit, grain, nuts, and seeds their entire life? Who can say? Are they eating it there while they're in this retirement enclave? Potentially. But if you read the fine print of the Adventist Health Studies and you actually go back to other interviews that I've read about these people, a little bit of meat, a little bit of fish, a little bit of cheese is okay occasionally. Did you know in the Adventist Health Studies, you can still be defined as a vegan as long as you don't eat meat, eggs, fish, or cheese more than once a month. Now,
I did
if
not
they
know
didn't
that.
eat that diet their entire life, and then they're still topping up enough vitamin B12, enough vitamin K2 and A and D, if they're still getting enough of that and they're leading a really active life, they're in an incredibly supportive community. They don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke tobacco, they don't do a lot of other things, and they exercise and they move and they've got purpose. These people that have moved to Loma Linda to retire potentially are the healthy, what do you call them? The healthy group. They haven't died, they haven't been sick, they've come there and they're being held up. 2015 when they 2023 when they did the recent Netflix documentary, the people he interviewed were in their 80s. Incredibly fit, incredibly healthy, but they were 80. They weren't 90 and they weren't 100. They're the 5 blue zones that we've been led to believe are
Mm,
plant-based, and now you know why. Because from the outset, the Adventist Health Study lead researcher has been on the Blue Zones board, and Dan Butner and his son are still on there. They have sold the Blue Zones franchise to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 2020.
mm. Yes, and it
So
is a business, and the
it, it
commercialization of the blue zones, terrible.
it's a commercialization, but it's also um, evangelism,
Mm,
because the Seventh-day Adventist Church truly believes that until enough people hear this health reform message on the third angel's message in the Bible that Ellen G. White added this health reform to, which I believe, and I've read in research that it's an identity, it's a tool to evangelize, and all of these things, this health reform message, this is now being put out as the blue zone messaging. You know, this is it now. The Adventist Health own that message.
frightening, really. And also, it is erasing the real food history of the communities. It's actually
It is.
shifting what they ate originally. Anyway,
And not just
um,
what they ate, but what gave them health and
yes,
longevity.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. Yes, yes. What got them in there in the first place? But um,
Mm.
I mean, the blue zones. It is so deep, and yes, you're right. Before we spoke, you said you could be on for 2 hours. I tend to do shorter interviews, but the blue
Yeah.
zone is so deep. Actually, yes, we could talk for long, but I want to just go a bit broader, if you don't mind, because one of the things that you put in the email, I'm going to just reverse it and just say it as a
Mhm.
question,
Oh,
short and
yes.
succinct. Who decides what we eat?
When we eat and why.
Who no? Who decides what
Who
we eat?
decides what we eat? That's my question. Who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why? I believe who decides what we eat. I've mentioned some names, but I believe the Seventh-day Adventist Church have been very, very influential, and we could go on for hours in
Mhm,
my discussion in this space. But if you I'll try and do a quick one, just catch me up. So, John Harvey Kellogg, a lot of people have heard of
mhm,
Kellogg's cornflakes. John Harvey Kellogg was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. His father paid for the church to really set up their things in 1863 at Battle Creek, Michigan, in Battle Creek, Michigan. And so at the age of 12, John Harvey Kellogg went to work for the first family of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He went to typeset Ellen G. White's writings, her testimonies to the church, and that was the year that she had this big health reform vision. So there's a lot of writing about that. He also typeset a book called A Solemn Appeal to Mothers, which spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbating. And her belief was that masturbation was the most heinous sin. You could never get to heaven if you masturbated. She believed it caused criminal behavior, it caused epilepsy, it caused decaying of the head, like all of these things. He's a 12-year-old and he's typesetting this horrific description of what would happen if you masturbate. She blamed soft beds. She blamed at the time children were sleeping in the same beds. She blamed, I don't know if it was Mills and Boone back then, but whatever the risque book was that women were reading and then children got hold of, she blamed all sorts of things for that. But in particular, she blamed, um, I guess, alcohol and tobacco for older people, but for children, spices and red meat in particular. She wrote that if a mother puts meat in front of her child, how does she expect her prayers to be answered? So this is a young boy of 12 writing this book, and I say he did that for 4 years, typeset for them. Then they paid for him to study medicine. Is it any wonder he spent his entire life trying to work out how to stop people from sinful masturbation? He invented and patented bland health food to take the place of flesh, meat, eggs, milk, and butter. This was his mission. His protege was a lady called Lena Frances Cooper, and she founded the American Dietetics Association. She was the very first industry dietitian. So, sorry, just quickly, Kellogg's cornflakes was never owned by the church. John Harvey Kellogg and his brother Will Keith split off when Will Keith wanted to add sugar and commercialize it and do other things. But John Harvey Kellogg had Sanitas food and he had other foods, and he gave the profits from those foods, he gave the recipes to the church for no cost. That was his giving. So he stayed giving for a long time. As I say, in about 1902, 1903, there was a bit of an issue. And so by 1905, she moved to Loma Linda. But I've found correspondence where he was still writing to her as mother right up until she almost up to when she died. They didn't lose communication between the two of them. So he truly believed in the health reform, in how to create these foods. So then we've got the American Dietetics Association starting along that way. By the 1940s, a guy called Mervyn Harding, who had grown up as a devout Seventh-day Adventist, wanted and has actually stated, along with a couple of others, we're doing work to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. There's another fellow who invented the first soy infant formula who said, we can rely on God to bring us other food so that we can get rid of meat, eggs, milk, and butter. God will provide us with the knowledge and how to create and patent these foods. So it's huge if you look at where the artificial meats and the artificial milks and all of those things have come from, especially soy in the Western world. This is industrial processed. This isn't the soy temper that the Asians fermented slowly, and we're talking about industrial process slush that's gone through and been deodorized and bleached and whatever else. So all of those things. Then you've got Mervyn Harding. He wanted to prove, not disprove, so he started working with Fred Steyer at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he did his master's and his doctoral dissertation under Fred Steyer. The Harvard School of Public Health had literally been bankrolled by the food industry from its founding right through. In his memoir, he says, I think it was something like $26 million in the first few years had been given. This is way back in the, mid 1900s. Bankrolled the start of this. So you've got a man, and also he's been highly paid by sugar industry, from Kristen Kearns, her outing and the amazing research that she's done. But you think that this man's been paid to demonize animal protein and fat and minimize the harms of sugar, minimize the harms of processed food. His father owned the Continental Canning Company, and it was canning everything. So Harvard University owned millions of shares in this canning company. So it was very conflicted as far as I'm concerned. But you've got a man who's come in with a belief, a devout belief in salvation. Salvation hinges on following the Sabbath and talking to people about the health benefits of fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds, getting rid of meat. Like, that's a heinous sin. How can we do this? So he's doing his doctoral dissertation. This was printed in the 1950s, went into the American Dietetics Association again, because by then there were other people involved and it wasn't just all plants, but still had a plant bias. Taken through to the McGovern report. Now, Senator George McGovern relied a lot on a guy called Nathan Pritikin. And I don't know if you remember the Pritikin diet. It was low fat, and it was high carb. Anyway, Nathan Pritikin was a adjunct professor at Loma Linda University. Or actually, it was called the College of Medical Evangelists back then. He was an adjunct professor. Can't say he was an Adventist, haven't been able to find that, but he was working at the Adventist University teaching their health. And he founded he founded his Pritikin Longevity Centre. So then the story goes on and on. But anyway, he spoke at the Senate inquiry. A guy called Nick Motton, who was Senator George McGovern's aide, he wrote the first dietary goals, and I've heard he was a vegetarian, if not a vegan, if not Seventh-day Adventist. I've heard a couple of hints, but definitely a vegetarian. And then you look at the guidelines, and honestly, when you look at different things, it was industry, it was Adventism, it was all sorts of things coming in and putting a lot of pressure. They said the meat industry was tough, but oh gosh, meat industry has no funding compared to the soy industry, the corn, you know, high fructose corn syrup, all of these things. And then you've got the chemical inputs if you don't have animals using the manure. It's a big, big, big world that's come in. Who decides? Not me. Not you. Sorry.
Yes.
Never give a short answer. Sorry about that.
No, that's
Not us.
fine. No, it's fine. And but I mean, the thing is, it's so frightening when you actually start to go down the rabbit hole and you realise that you're being misled left, right, and centre, and it's always conflicts of interests.
Yeah.
There's always something behind it, and it's sadly never about health. It never
Well, did you
seems
know
to.
that even your Olympic swimming team was sponsored by Sanitarium here in Australia?
Wow.
Up,
Didn't know that.
up and go. Now you have a look at the ingredients in Up and Go, and it
Mhm,
is a chemical storm. It is not real food, and it's meant to
mm,
be a meal replacement for breakfast.
mm.
And
Yeah.
they Up and Go sponsored your Olympic swimming team, so you've got it there too. It's not just here in
Ah,
Australia.
yeah, without a doubt, it's worldwide, definitely. So I'm gonna finish with a more personal question, okay? Because and I've lived this. I've had terrible comments on Twitter and X and on my YouTube channel and even on my Substack saying this is terrible information. I've you and Gary have had significant pushback, significant, and Gary
Gary
was
has,
obviously
not
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Gary, not me.
what kept you going when it would have been easier to just roll over and be quiet?
We grew up in Sydney. I'm not saying it was a school of hard knocks, but we weren't privileged, um, as a lot of people are. And I think we worked really hard for what we had. We worked really hard for our kids. We were lucky when Gary was we had children very young. So by the time Gary was being reported and in trouble, our children were mostly through school. Even one was through university. So, and I don't know, Gary's family had been German Jews, and his mother and uncle had hidden in a cupboard during during the war. For a period of time, they'd had to escape. His grandmother had stood up to the Nazis, and if you go to the Nazi War Museum, the, during the trials, Nuremberg trials, one of the SS people say the only admired three Jewish people, and Gary's grandmother was one of them. So I think he's come from a social background of fighting for not
Mm,
just yourself, but for the people. We grew up and we both went. Okay, it took a long time to actually start talking about my research, but Gary ended up convincing me that not talking about it was causing more harm. He said the dietary guidelines here in Australia, Sanitarium were in on the dietary guidelines. They've designed the Health Star rating system. Their actual technical advisor was designing the algorithms for the Health Star ratings on our food. They are educating children through a life education program. Like their influence is massive here in Australia. And he said to me, this low fat, high carb diet, the cereals, the alternative meats, the the plant milks, like, they're just not good. Up and Go is bad. We need to talk about this because this is about something much bigger than us. We're fighting for more people. We're trying to get people's metabolic health back. He felt very responsible for his patients. And so I guess we were also told by a politician here in Tasmania that if we wanted to keep going, this was early on, he said, "You've got two choices. You can either hide, walk away and hide and pretend none of this is happening and just deal with whatever, or you go very, very loud." Because it's like the Barbara Streisand effect. We pointed out that APRA was colluding with the cereal for brekkie, with the cereal for brekkie industry. We pointed out that our Dietitians Association at the time was taking money from this group that hashtagged themselves cereal for brekkie, and it was Sanitarium and Kellogg's and Nestle. They were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 per year to use their members. So this has meant dietitians didn't necessarily understand, which is why that dietitian reported Gary. They were to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal grains and sugar. And Gary's name was on those documents as targeted for active defense. So when we realized that these big people were coming, or these big industries, these big businesses were coming after little old us for just trying to make things better, we went, well, what have we really got to lose? So we went louder. And it's been amazing. We've met the most incredible people. We've traveled the world, but we've changed guidelines. Gary's changed guidelines, and we've allowed people to start to understand where this plant bias messaging is coming from, where the demonization of animal protein and fats is coming from, Stephen. And it's giving back health to you. It's giving back health to us. It's giving health to our children, our grandchildren. So that's why. And
Yes.
I've had very little pushback. In fact, until I did a recent talk with Jesse Chappis, I could honestly say I could count on two hands the amount of negative comments that have really not been anything in particular in the last 12 years I've been doing this work. But he's managed to get a few trolls on there that have gone, well, and not been so nice, but the majority have been lovely and really incredible. And I think it's because it's come from a place of trying to protect my husband and trying to do the right thing. I'm not trying to pick on people, little people. It's big industry. So let's keep doing it.
Yeah, and eventually the truth always comes to the surface. And I'm going to be really honest, Belinda. You've absolutely inspired me again. You're a
Oh,
very inspirational person, and
thank you.
yes, I have a lot of pushback, and I think um, you're right with Gary. Obviously, it 10 times worse, or maybe 100 times worse than I've ever had. But it does chisel away at you sometimes when all you're
It
trying to
does.
do is make people better and give them the real
Well,
information.
that 2 years I had off, I think I really needed that. I just took time for family. I just embodied our local community, our beautiful friends, and I just went, I'm just coming back to this for a little while. But as I say, the Netflix documentary, when my daughter's friends started saying they needed to eat plants because that's what a Blue Zone diet is, started seeing
Mm.
dietitians promoting Blue Zone's diet, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm coming back. And I've gotten really excited and inspired because, as I say, finally, I think I need that break as well. And all of these pieces have just fallen into place. And it's just like, it's just it's magic to write about because it's sort of like, oh my gosh, it's all there. Like it ties into the
Yes.
Mediterranean and ties into lifestyle medicine. Like everything's all coming together because the blue zones, as I say, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine was founded on the Loma Linda University campus, and they're now accrediting doctors as blue zone doctors. So it's just round and round and round. It's unbelievable. But I really thank you for having me, and I think I'm hoping I do give some courage and confidence to people, at least to stand up for their own health. And can I just finish with one inspirational sort of
Of
story?
course.
So, a guy called Harvey Wiley was part of the poison squad in America in the 1900s, early. His big thing was trying to get cocaine and caffeine out of Coca Cola. He believed it was contributing to a lot of the crime and a lot of family domestic violence, all sorts of things. He was really concerned about it. And it didn't matter where he got to because he was employed by Roosevelt. So it didn't matter where he got to in the government in America, different levels, someone was always blocking because they're being paid off by Coca-Cola. So he threw up his arms and he went and worked for a women's magazine. This highly qualified scientist went and worked for a women's magazine because he said, I'm going to the women because they purchase. They're the buyers, they're the ones who feed their families. And if I tell them what's happening here, this is how I'll make a difference. And it was women who marched on um, the American government, who marched, and they were the ones who managed to get the levels of caffeine and cocaine. I don't think it came out completely, but minimized compared to what it was. It was people power. And so
Mm.
we have that opportunity to, like, we're helping people understand, but it's the people. They can buy the foods that we're recommending or suggesting. Stop buying all the highly processed foods because industry will change because of purchasing power. And I think that it's a really big story to think of that. You've got the power to change because you don't buy those things anymore.
That is a brilliant story to end on. So, Belinda,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Stephen.